Welcome back to Finding Your Place in AI Ethics Consulting. Now that we have a general framework for the basic modes of working, we're going to now look at sort of more specific tasks and specific skills associated with those tasks. And we're going to start now talking about the non-technical tasks. So while the work that we do and the work that you'll probably be doing is focused on AI and technology and algorithmic systems, the vast majority of what you'll be doing on a day-to-day basis is non-technical. And the reason for this is simply that when you look at the socio-technical system in which an algorithm is embedded, most of that is social as opposed to technical. The technical bit is typically very, very small piece of the overall system, and it also contributes really a small piece to the likelihood of risk of harms. And so a lot of what needs to be done is actually in this social sort of non-technical space. We'll focus on the technical things in the next lecture. But while we're talking now, what I'd like you to be doing is listening for places where your non-technical skills and experiences can be useful. So as I talk, I want you to be looking for places where you can find your place and apply your skills. So let's take a look again at this sort of examples that I had listed before. So probably the most common, and this is a biased view because at BABL we have a lot of ethicists that we work with that are on staff. And so ethical reasoning is one of the most common non-technical tasks that you'll be doing. So I'm not an ethicist, but I try to learn ethics every day from my colleagues. But ethical reasoning is critically important, trying to figure out what ought to happen in a given situation and what sort of ethical commitments your clients might have towards various stakeholders. So this is something that happens a lot, and it's a skill that does need to be practiced, and you typically need to have some training in ethics in order to do any work in AI ethics and governance consulting. And so finding places to get some training in AI ethics or ethics in general rather is pretty important. Another common thing is conducting interviews, and this is a task which is clearly non-technical. There are times when it can be very technical in nature, but just the task of interviewing someone and trying to get information that is relevant for your research and for the risks that are involved, that happens a lot. That's a very common non-technical thing to do. And preparing for those interviews is also really important. What kind of questions need to be asked? And this is typically a group exercise. It's something that everybody on the team participates in. But the conducting interviews is a very, very common thing that we do. When interviews aren't possible, we still need to get input from either people within the company or other stakeholders, constructing and delivering surveys is something else that is very common. And so this is a whole skill in and of itself in order to do this correctly. And so asking the right questions such that you're going to get the information that you need is something that if you have experience doing that, that's really, really valuable. Along the same lines, general sort of stakeholder mapping and engagement. So when we say stakeholder mapping, it's essentially figuring out A, who the stakeholders are, and B, what their relationship is to the client, and what kind of commitments the client might have to these stakeholders. And engaging with those stakeholders is pretty important. The most vulnerable of those being the ones who are on the other end of the algorithm. And so this is something that's critically important. We think this is very important in this research and in working in this field. And so if you have skills or experience getting input from external stakeholders, that's a very valuable place to provide input. As we mentioned before, legal research. We have lawyers that work as consultants at BABL AI, but all of us are expected to keep up with regulations. And so legal research, if you have experience doing this, if you're an attorney or a lawyer, or have some law training, this is really valuable. And so learning how to read sometimes fairly technical in terms of legalese documents is pretty important. And just keeping up with the general trends in regulation, knowing what is being proposed that may be relevant for your clients or relevant for AI in general, and being able to parse through those documents and extract sort of relevant information is something that we do on a regular basis. Even when we're not working with clients, we do it on behalf of current clients or clients that we have worked with or future clients. And we sort of try to figure out what relevant information is in there. User experience research. This is something that we have done. And if you have an AI system, it's going to be interacting with humans, either the user or some other stakeholder. And so the interaction of the humans and the computer, that's really important to understand how that works, because it does have ethical implications. And so when we've worked with clients, we've had to worry about how the AI presents itself to the end user. And we've had to do some experimentation and some research into the field, and sometimes actual physical research with participants, to get a better understanding of how does that interaction happen, and does it have an effect on potential ethical harm or risk. And so if you have experience doing this sort of research, that can easily be applied in consulting work. Education and training. Commonly, when you're engaging with a client, there comes a point where either through a recommendation or just necessity, there has to be some education or training of the client or people within the client's organization. And so if you have experience as a teacher or conducting some sort of training or developing training or pedagogy, these sorts of things are definitely applicable. And so if you are sort of just starting out and you have some experience in education, there is a place for using those skills in consulting. And then, etc. There are so many others, non-technical skills. And in fact, almost any skill that you have gained is going to be relevant for this field. It's so diverse and so dynamic that you can really bring all of your personal and professional experiences to bear in some way on the work that you'll be doing, which is part of why I like this field so much, and I think part of why so many people are drawn to this field at this point in time. So in addition to these sort of non-technical tasks that we do, in general, there's also domain-specific knowledge, which is important. And there are certain industries where AI is being adopted faster, let's say, than other industries. And so it's important to get some knowledge, domain-specific knowledge in those industries. And so there are also some industries that are higher risk. It's not just that they're adopting AI faster, but they're adopting AI and it's potentially risky. So human resources is one of those areas where there's a lot of potential for risk, and there's also a pretty high probability that regulation will be coming in the near future. And so if you have experience in human resources, separate from AI, we're talking just domain-specific experience, and you're interested in AI ethics, there's definitely a place for applying that knowledge as a consultant. So if you can combine your knowledge of AI ethics and governance with human resources knowledge, then there's a lot of potential places to get work and to help companies try to mitigate what is going to be significant risk especially regulatory risk. Education and EdTech, this is another area which would be deemed high risk under the European Union's proposed regulations, but it's also a place where US is focusing potential regulation. And so if you have experience as an educator or in the EdTech industry itself, and you want to apply sort of AI governance knowledge to that, this is a very good area to apply your domain-specific knowledge. Finance and fintech, this is an area where there already is a lot of regulation, and a lot of people have been thinking for a long time about how best to regulate algorithmic systems. And there are, Federal Reserve has guidelines for model risk management, but there are new risks with these sort of more complex algorithms that haven't fully been figured out. And so if you work in finance or fintech or have experience in that or some knowledge through university training, that's a place where your domain-specific knowledge can be of great use. Insurance is sort of a subcategory of this, where things like fraud detection or figuring out who qualifies for insurance, that sort of thing, there's a big chance that that's going to be regulated specifically in terms of AI and what kind of external data you can use. And so this is also another place where if you have experience there, then it definitely applies. Medicine and public health, the same thing. If you have some knowledge of the inner workings of how public health and or hospitals operate, that can be applied, because this is still an emerging field, and the FDA has guidelines, if you're in the US, has guidelines for using AI ethically, but they're very new, and so it's still a dynamic landscape for regulation. So there's a lot of potential there. If you have knowledge of ethics, culture, ESG, these are definitely places where you can directly apply your domain knowledge to AI ethics and governance. And really, this is some of the most important areas, especially ethical culture within organizations. That's where the change is going to happen internally to mitigate risk. And so any insights are really important that you can bring to bear. And then there's legal compliance and risk. So there's a whole lot in there. But if you've worked in as a counsel in a corporation, or worked in compliance within a corporation, or worked in risk, then a lot of the same methodologies are going to get used for AI ethics and governance. And so for people who have experience in these domains, you're going to be able to directly apply your knowledge. And in fact, AI ethics and governance, on the other hand, could directly apply to your current position if you're in one of these roles. And so these are very tightly linked, and this is a place where experience in these domains is going to be very valuable, and you can quickly transition to consulting. So the moral of the story is most of what you've done in your career or what you've studied at school can be applied in some way to solving problems in AI governance. And so the question is simply finding what you're good at. So as you know, I asked you as I was talking to sort of try to think about where you see yourself in what I've said. And if you can concentrate on what you have for specific skills, in this case, in the non-technical skills, and think about where you can apply it, that's going to be the most advantageous route for you, is really think about what you have, what are your strongest skills. There's going to be a place to apply them. And please, feel free to reach out to me and ask if you have ideas about, or specific skills, or you think, how does this apply? It's likely that I would have seen situations where those sorts of skills could have applied, and I might be able to help you identify those specific areas and really try to double down on them. So the question might be now, given all of these different tasks that are non-technical that get performed, what are the requisite skills? And the answer is there's more than we can count here. There's so many skills, and that's the great thing. There are so many skills which can be applied, and so the question is just finding that use case. And each task needs a different set of skills, and they're all context dependent. So your main focus now is finding where is it that you can apply those skills. What particular domain, which industry, what part of the AI governance or ethics process do you bring the most value? So, you can go the other way and focus on a specific problem that you've identified, let's say, and ask, what do I need for skills and knowledge to solve that problem? So it could be that you want to go the other way and there's something that you feel like is problematic in the industry and you want to solve that problem. And then what you have to do is say, what's the profile of the person that can solve that problem? And do I fit that profile? And if not, how do I acquire the skills in order to do it? So again, in this case, using case studies is a great way to figure out what's going on. And I can't emphasize this enough. Just doing this, just going in and assessing risk and trying to solve problems, even if you're not being paid, even if it's just taking a news article and trying to figure out how would you have approached this problem, that's where you're going to quickly start realizing the variety of skills that you need and the variety of practical tasks that have to get done in order to solve these problems. So let's look at a particular case study. So this is one that I have personal experience with, but it's sort of general and broad. And I encourage you to think about your own. Imagine an EdTech company, and this EdTech company has a product which essentially what it does is it uses a very basic algorithm. And so when I say basic algorithm, it might be like looking at word counts, references, sentence complexity, in order to assign a score to a discussion post. So it might be a discussion forum and someone makes a post. This is an EdTech company, remember. And so in a university setting, let's say someone writes a post, and what this basic algorithm does is it assigns a score, and it's really, really simple based on word count, sentence complexity, that sort of thing, whether they have references or images or links. And the goal here is to increase feedback, so get some sort of instantaneous feedback that's separate from the professor, so it happens automatically, and to encourage more thoughtful discussion and engagement. So get people to engage. Anyone who's taught a class knows that getting students to engage in a discussion sometimes can be difficult. You have to really prompt them to provide meaningful input, especially if they're busy. And so the goal here is just to give better feedback. And so this EdTech company comes to you as a consultant and says, I'm worried about AI ethics, and I know that there are a lot of worries about using AI in EdTech, let's say, but we'd like to start using some natural language processing, NLP, to enrich this algorithm so that it uses some real AI and can provide sort of more additional feedback and might sort of, they're just toying with the idea. They'd like to use it. And so what you as a consultant now are tasked with doing is to find the risk versus opportunity. So you need to assess that risk versus opportunity for them. And the risks, of course, are the same risks that we talked about last time. There are ethical risks, there are compliance risks, there's potentially safety risks, reputational risks. So you have to sort of figure out what is gained, what's the benefit of adding natural language processing to this algorithm, and then what are the risks associated with it, and try to figure out what the balance is. So what are the kind of tasks? So we're focusing on non-technical tasks here. What are the tasks that you might do? Well, the first one is is non-technical. It's define the ethical commitments. And this is easier said than done. But in general, you need to figure out what duties does this company have to the students and the professors that might be using their system. What are their ethical commitments? And that's not an easy thing to figure out. Sometimes it's straightforward, but you do need to think through what are their ethical commitments. What rights and interests do they have to protect? And so once you've done that, which is quite a bit of work, but once you've done that, then you need to sort of research specific natural language processing and failure modes. And so we're talking bias, toxic outputs, all of the things you could probably think of. And this is the semi-technical part, right? So this is where you need to have some technical knowledge and some research ability in AI to figure out what the application they're thinking of using and where are the ways in that can go wrong. And I say semi-technical because if you've had some training, even if you're a non-technical person in general, you can be trained to identify these and to understand how it works well enough to find most of the risks. Then there's also going to be some pedagogy and psychology research. So this is asking the question, what is added by the natural language processing? So whatever the client might have in mind for ways in which they'll use it, you have to kind of research, does that actually add anything in terms of the pedagogy that they're using? What are the goals that the system has, and does this further those goals? And then stakeholder engagement. You're going to have to figure out some sort of qualitative assessments and research to figure out what students' attitudes are and professors and worries towards and about the use of AI in this particular context. So you need to reach out to students. You need to talk to them and figure out what are they concerned about, what are the potential worries they have about AI, and that's an important step. And then, of course, there has to be some legal risk research. You got to figure out if using AI or natural language processing in this particular context, what further obligations does that place on the company? Do they need to announce that they're using some more sophisticated AI than they had previously? And so looking under GDPR or the FTC in the US, there are certain obligations that they have for disclosing to people who are using the system or not falsely advertising. And so there has to be some legal research there. So this is just one case study. So this is one, I'm not going to tell you so this was an actual case that we had, and we actually had some recommendations for them. I'm not going to tell you what they are because I think it would be interesting for you to sort of think through this yourself if you wanted to imagine this situation and what you would recommend. But it would be great to find another case study for yourself. So it's sufficient to just look at the news, find some algorithm out there or some use case that has made it to the news, which means they probably already had some problems, and then try to envision the practical steps needed to implement a solution. So you've already done a case study now last week, and now what I'd like you to do, ideally you could take that same case study and start walking through the actual steps. What would you need to do to implement your solution? So who do you need to talk to in the organization? What do you need to know about the algorithmic system? How do you assess that? How would you implement your governance solutions? Like, who do you literally talk to? What kind of documents would you need to put together? How is that recorded? How is it shared and passed through the organization? And taking the time to really step through these processes in your mind is really going to be illuminating. You're going to figure out quite quickly the kind of skills that you need in order to do that. And hopefully you envision yourself being able to do all of that. But there might be certain things that you feel like you can't do. And that's also good to know. to realize that you might need partners, you might need maybe to work as a team where you're applying very specific skills that you are very good at, or there are places where you need to improve your skills. And so I would write these down as an exercise and really try to go through those specific steps. And feel free to share it with me if you want to. I'm happy to give feedback on this. Another way of approaching this is going and talking to the companies themselves, companies and organizations. Talk to them about what their challenges are. And this, in a business sense, is called customer discovery, where you go and you try to figure out what it is that your potential customers might need. But in this case, what it also does is give you a little bit of an insight as to where you could apply your, in this case, non-technical skills. And you might find that there are some places unexpectedly that they really are valuable, that some potential clients may really be looking for those non-technical skills, but applied to the very highly technical area of AI. And we've seen this before, where we've talked to clients and we expected them to be really interested in a technical solution, maybe bias testing or some explainable AI. And what they really wanted to do, for instance, was look at their corporate values or speak up culture within their company, because they realized, rightly so, that these are very important things for mitigating risk. And so you might find, to your surprise, that some of these non-technical skills are actually highly valuable. And so getting out, talking to potential clients and customers, there's no substitute for doing this. And so case studies and going out and actually talking to people, these are two steps that I think are really critical for building up your niche, figuring out where you belong in this. And so I encourage you, if you have any questions, please comment below. Let's try to share ideas with each other, and I'm happy to provide feedback as best I can.